So yeah, just wanted to cover COP29 today. We wanted to do this webinar straight after the end of the COP. It's always a bit of a gamble because sometimes you don't know how long these things are going to overrun, but it did close over the weekend. And I suppose for those of you who don't know what a COP is, and I know I'm talking to a room full of sustainability professionals who should be aware, but it's a conference of the party, obviously an international conference all about climate change. But what I want to do today is talk briefly about COP29, talk about what the outputs were, think about how we can use COP, or whether we can use COP as a mechanism for communicating sustainability and climate change, and then finally thinking about what the outputs of COP mean to us as sustainability professionals and what they might mean to your organisation. So just to put the COP into a bit of context, we're nearly 5 years into the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement. The most recent global stocktake revealed stark realities. Whilst progress has been made towards reducing emissions, the progress that has been made has been insufficient really to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees, which we all know is so crucial. So this COP comes at a time when that global gap between ambition and action, which Sam's talked about today, threatens not only the environment, but also the stability of economies and communities worldwide. So the stakes really couldn't be higher. The science tells us we're approaching irreversible tipping points, and the geopolitics reminds us that the challenges of cooperation are huge in this growingly fragmented world. So this COP was really important. It's where action really had to meet ambition. So 65,000 attendees descended on Baku in Azerbaijan for 2 weeks of negotiation, and the sessions closed around 35 hours late, which, as I say, is not too bad for a COP. So what were the results? And on the next slide, please. So this COP was always going to be hailed as the finance COP. It was all about climate finance, and that's a real key sticking point for the COP in terms of how much financial commitment developed countries should be making. The headline figure for climate finance was a tripling of the funding agreed to be made available by developed nations, a tripling of that budget to £300 billion per year. This is now being called the Baku finance goal. However, is 300 billion enough? Is estimated that the actual true cost, the amount of funding actually required, is something like 1.3 trillion pounds, and that's what countries from least developed nations and poorer countries were pushing for, and that was a big sticking point. But I'll talk more about that in a second. There was agreement on carbon markets, which is very positive. That's something which previous COPs haven't been able to achieve. These agreements will help countries deliver the climate plans more quickly, more cheaply, and make faster progress in halving global emissions this decade, as required by the science. From a global stocktake perspective, this is essentially how we measure collective progress towards long-term climate goals. It wasn't good news on this front. Many wanted to reiterate, to track, and to embed the wording agreed at the previous COP around transitioning away from fossil fuels and to submit climate pledges aligned with the 1.5 degree limit. No agreement was made. Ultimately, it was blocked at the last moment amid complaints from developed and from vulnerable nations that the draft text was watered down, and it was watered down to the extent that it was a backtrack from commitments taken last year. So decisions on that fossil fuels statement, on global stocktake, has now been pushed forward to the COP30, which will be in Brazil. And then the controversies, of which there were a number. So the elephant in the room perhaps is Azerbaijan as the host, a big petro-state. 2/3 of the government revenue is derived from fossil fuels. Just before the COP, the president of Azerbaijan described oil and gas as a gift from God. So not really setting the stage for massive decisions and agreements about reducing fossil fuels and about reducing climate emissions. Towards the end of the COP, two big blocks of nations staged a walkout in protest over the negotiations and about the amount being agreed. Um, the the Alliance of Small Island States and the LDC, the Least Developed Countries bloc, walked out in protest. They did rejoin. They did ultimately agree on a form of wording, but it's the first time that walkout has ever happened, as I understand. And then obviously the whole COP was held under the spectre of the US election and the results from that. And you have to ask the question whether the idea that it's likely that the US will withdraw from the Paris Agreement, it's likely that they will withdraw from their climate commitments. Did that then push the LDCs, those least economically developed countries, and the Alliance of Small Island States to agree to this text on the basis that they knew that in future years it might be even more difficult to come to a deal? But it also perhaps led the US election might have led for some positives around the UK, around the EU, and around China stepping up to take more of a global leadership position in climate negotiations, and that might be a trend which we see continuing. And then finally, from a controversy perspective, it was fairly widely positioned that the negotiation strategy led by Azerbaijan was fairly poorly run process. It put into question the effectiveness of COP. It put into question how COPs are run and how agreements are formed, and criticism led primarily by Nigeria and India around how they felt they were left out of negotiations. Next slide, please. So it can make, sometimes you look at COP and Claire, as I see you note in the comments in the chat as well, it can be very disheartening listening to the COP outputs, listening to the intricacies of geopolitics and listening to not a lot of action sometimes being taken. But I thought this quote from Christiana, the former UN climate chief, was quite powerful. It's that COP process is an essential and irreplaceable vehicle for supporting multilateral, multi-sectoral, and a systemic change that we urgently need. COP isn't perfect, but is there an alternative? It gets 200 countries around the table. It has to be the mechanism for those big changes which we need to see the world undertake. Next slide, please. So thinking about the outputs from COP, I just wanted to explore a little bit about whether COP and whether COP29 particularly cut through the noise we all face in our everyday lives, whether it becomes useful to us all as professional sustainability professionals to help communicate the issues that we work on. So I've got a quick poll for us. So the first poll, Sam, if you can, is about, have you published any communications in your organisation about COP29? Have you put out a newsletter? Have you written a news article? Have you done a blog? Have you done anything about communicating the COP29 to your people? We'll just wait a couple of seconds for everyone's responses to trickle in. Thank you. So overwhelmingly no, which 75% no at the moment, which is very interesting. I'll come back to that in a second. And then my second question is, for you personally, have you read about COP29 in the press? Have you seen a news bulletin? Have you read an article online in print? And that's our second poll. Good. Okay. So thanks everyone for submitting. So, I think from our experience, the sustainability engagement experts, engaging people around a COP can be very tricky. We know COPs are technical. We know there's lots of jargon. The lack of direct impact on people's lives means it isn't always something which cuts through the noise. And it's interesting to see that a lot of the people here, I think 70%, 80% there, didn't do any communication around COP29. But the only thing I'd say about that is anything which gets climate change and sustainability on the news is positive. It raises people's awareness and it raises people's understanding. I will say a caveat would be there are some exceptions to this around engaging people around COPs. And I think there's occasions where we might understand that a COP is going to make a big decision, a bit like Paris nearly 10 years ago, a bit like when UK hosted COP in Glasgow. Those sort of events generate a lot more noise, a lot more cut through, and would be a target for me when communicating with people around attaching climate messaging to those sort of events. But for a regular COP, it can be very tricky. And I think we see that evidenced in the poll as well. Okay, so for the last section on what to expect for my organisation, well, I think there's distilled these into four main areas. So regulatory changes. The UK has committed to more ambitious NDC, that's nationally determined contributions, the amount of carbon that we're going to cut. It's likely, and a bit like looking into a crystal ball, but it's highly likely that we can then expect regulations aimed at reducing carbon emissions because of that commitment. Staying ahead of those changes will be crucial for compliance and competitiveness. A good example of that is the Climate and Nature Bill currently back in Parliament, currently being discussed in Parliament. That's something which will strengthen from a regulation and legislation perspective, the changes that we'll all have to make. Investment in sustainability is going to have to go up. There's going to be increased government pressure on businesses to invest in more sustainable practices and technologies. This might include adopting renewable energies, improving energy efficiency, and certainly reducing waste. And then from a reporting perspective, I think Laura, you mentioned CSRD. So that landscape is going to keep evolving. ESG criteria is only going to be influenced by COP29 outcomes. It's highly likely that organisations will need to provide in the future more detailed and transparent disclosures about sustainability performance. And then finally on this, the corporate climate commitments. The private sector is expected to play a key role in delivering some of those COP29 outcomes. And that $300 billion annual contribution from developed countries is also, has been agreed alongside a 1.3 trillion voluntary number, which we're all aiming for, and governments will be looking at the private sector to help finance a lot of that. So pressure will be on for organisations to increase their climate commitments and investments, advocating for stronger policies and regulatory environments to support a just transition for every nation. So just to conclude, really, COP29, it's been a step forward for global climate action. Whether it's a big step or a little step, I'll leave you to decide. For us, sustainability professionals at organisations, it presents both challenges and opportunities. What we can do is by staying informed, being proactive. I think that way companies can not only comply with new regulations, but also lead the way in sustainability, driving positive change and securing long-term success. So thanks very much for listening. Any questions, please do put them in the Q&A there, and happy to get to them. Back over to you, Laura. Thank you.